The RPK-16, the 6P70 AK-12's bigger brother, indeed saw combat across the world in the hands of Russian Spetsnaz forces. But where did it truly end up? First, there was the official Ministry of Defense test and evaluation, including in the chaotic Syrian civil war, as Russian forces worked to secure and prop up the battered Ba'athist regime. After that, the weapon has witnessed the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, after remaining in select Spetsnaz brigade arsenals, which Kalashnikov Concern's own specialist representatives at the front have kept tabs on. Even a former athlete madman, donning a Maska helmet and three-stripe tracksuit, would use his favorite RPK-16 to terrorize the formerly Emercom commandeered Ultra shopping mall in the closed-off Norvinsk region. Despite all of this, it was the Light Support Weapon concept's last hurrah for Russia. That concept would become officially forgotten with the beginning of the RPL-20s fielding with VDV forces in eastern Ukraine. Even though the Soviet army were the ones that originally pioneered the concept, with the original 7.62 by 39mm RPK and 5.45 by 39mm RPK-74. For their own part, Kalashnikov Concern, formerly Izmash, and Vyatsky Polyani Molot did not completely slack with the development of this new, exclusively mag-fed machine gun. In 2015, it started against the backdrop of the Tokar programs and the later Kipchak program's RPK-400 to complement the rescue effort of the Ministry of Defense's Ratnik program by the AK-400, which would later become the adopted AK-12. At the heart of the gun is the classic Kalashnikov system, a long-stroke piston system with a rotating lugged bolt, sitting in a stamped receiver. The receiver itself is of the spec of an RPK-74M. The sheet metal is 1.5mm thick compared to the 1mm thickness of the standard AK, and surrounds a bulged front trunnion. The rear trunnion has the folding stock mechanism that was the mainline standard since the AK-100 series. The railed receiver cover was essentially the same, entirely detachable cover as the Type 1 AK-12. The retention pin for it, in the front trunnion, differed from the AK-12 and throughout the RPK-16's lifetime. Its performance at holding a zero compared to the AK-12 isn't quite as well known. One of the more unique features of the RPK-16 was its easy change barrel system. A dovetail clamp, torqued down by a large screw, would secure the barrel to the trunnion it slid into. This system wasn't meant for swapping out an overheated barrel in the field, despite how desirable that is for a suppressive fire weapon. Instead, it was intended to ease the maintenance and logistical burden of the weapon, as it was expected to achieve a high round count. To complement the easy change barrel system were two modular options in barrel lengths, 590mm or 23.2 inches as standard for the RPK, and the AK standard of 415mm or 16.3 inches. Both featured hefty and tampered profiles to serve as heat sinks. The flash hider would differ a bit throughout the weapon's life. At first, it simply boasted a birdcage design. Later, and most typically seen, was a thick three-prong design compatible with a proprietary suppressor. The all-polymer handguard follows the eventual philosophy of the adopted AK-12. It was pinned in the barrel around the chamber end and covered up the barrel clamp. Like the AK-12 handguard, removal was easy and simply required a flat spring to be depressed via a tiny pinhole in order to remove the main pin. The handguard made the design trade-off of being lightweight and easily free-floated from the barrel. The latter meant pressure against the handguard, such as from a bipod, couldn't cause a point of impact shift. However, this came at the downside of the handguard itself, lacking the rigidity to be ideal for maintaining the zero of mounted laser aiming modules. The rest of the furniture matches the Type 1 AK-12. Inside the pistol grip, releasable by a round button, is the cleaning kit, with the cleaning rod broken down. The length of pull adjustable stock emulates an AR's stock and buffer tube. However, it's completely incompatible and, as previously mentioned, folding. The selector is also the same as the Type 1 AK-12, with a thumb shelf, but only 3 positions: safe, semi, and full. The front sight and gas block became a combo to roughly match the AK-12, for the sake of cost and simplicity, and it was included in the gas tube's setup. The windage-adjusted rear iron was moved as far back as possible to increase sight radius and to act as a diopter sight for more precise shooting. The front iron sight, sliding in a dovetail cut, was also windage adjustable to accommodate zeroing of the modular barrels. The magazines included with the RPK-16 were the standard AK-12 6L2301 magazine and the M125, originally M121, 95-round drum.
Cool. drum here? Yeah, I've got the drum and it's loaded, so...
As a machine gun, of course, the drum was supposed to be a critical cornerstone of the kit. The drum was originally developed for the requirements of the Ratnik program's assault rifle and the AK-12, even back to Vladimir Zlobin's AK-12 prototype. Those features very much fit the bill of an RPK-74 for the 21st century. Now, all these features were simply the words of the thesis that is the original RPK laid out. It's what's colloquially called the Light Support Weapon, or sometimes the Infantry Automatic Rifleman concept in the West. The basic idea is simple: an alternative version of the standard issue rifle of an army, with modifications to lend itself to spitting as much lead as possible. Typically, this is accomplished with a heavier barrel, bipod, greater capacity magazines, and perhaps other features, such as the ability to fire from an open bolt. Squad-level tactics and modern warfare's emphasis on mobility always have a hunger for suppressing fire to enable friendly advances, often on the flank, or to simply keep the enemy from advancing. Belt feds do that the best, but at heavy logistical trade-offs. Compared to an LSW Disciple weapon, they're more expensive and require exclusive belts, parts, training and familiarization, and often different cartridges to flow down the supply chain. These little things are butterfly wings beating tornadoes for the massive moving machines of an army, especially any Cold War-era army, expected to operate over an entire continent in any given moment. Even within the squad element, it causes complications, as in an emergency, one squad member can't just simply hand a magazine from his allocation to the oh-so-hungry machine gunner. Amongst the West, examples of the LSW concept, in service and not, include the L-86, the G-36 MG, the Colt automatic rifle, the Marines IAR M27, asterisk aplenty, FN Fallow, the Colt IAR, and the AUG H-bar. While the Bren, Bar, and ZB-26, using calibers of the squad's bolt-action infantry rifles, had an inkling of the concept back in the day, the Soviets were the first to really forge it, and a total logistical unification of calibers. Albeit, the Canadian Armed Forces toyed around with the idea at a similar time with the FAL-based C2 in 1958. The Soviets' first step came shortly after World War II with the decision to make every new small arm in their inventory 7.62 by 39mm. Their new, quote, submachine gun, the AK-47, standard rifle, the SKS, and the LMG, the RPD, would all follow that decree.
Increasing tension brings swift and dramatic measures. Soviet tanks move to the border. The United States Berlin Command responds quickly as our own tanks are dispatched to the area.
Later on, as concern over the Cold War became apparent, the Soviets looked to simplify the logistics of what would remain a large army. Therefore, they looked to change that lineup of small arms. From 1956 to 1961, the perfected stamped AKM would be developed to supplant the AK-47 and SKS, and importantly for our story, the RPK was to replace the RPD. As we have defined the LSW concept, the original RPK matched the AKM in about everything, but had a longer, heavier barrel, a reinforced and thicker receiver, a bipod, a clubbed stock for prone shooting, windage adjustable sights, and a couple other smaller tweaks. It was also supplied with long 40-round magazines and a 75-round drum. The Vyatsky Polyany Molot factory, instead of MT Kalashnikov's home plant in Izhevsk, would be in charge of its production. A folding stock version also existed for paratroopers, the RPKS. Later on in 1974, despite the belt-fed 7.62 by 54 RPK now on the stage, the Soviets would still keep the RPK in the switch from 7.62 by 39 to 5.45 by 39. Thus, the RPK-74 was born, and came only with long 45-round magazines. It would later receive updated polymer furniture and be made to essentially match the standard of the AK-100 series, and much later, the standard of the AK-200 series. Separate from Molot's offerings, Izmash attempted its own lineup of RPKs in the late 90s with its RPK-100 series. These guns were based on regular AK-74Ms, including their non-bulged receivers, but in the format of an RPK. This lineup was supposed to pair with their quad-stack magazine experiments at the time, and to grab a corner of the export market for the cash-strapped Izmash factory. Ultimately, the guns didn't go anywhere, and photos are pretty rare. In 2013, the FSB would order for a modernized RPK under Vyuga-11, one of their V-initialed programs. No proper photos exist of the resulting OTs-81 gun, but internal employee testimony and a render from its manufacturer in Tula is available. The OTs-81 featured upgraded furniture, a dynamic fire rate, and a suppressor. Alongside it, as part of the program, were numerous 5.45 by 39mm drums. These include the 115-round OTs-82, only 100 rounds in practice, dual drum, the 70-round OTs-87, and the 75-round OTs-103. The program did apparently see some success, but its results have never left the obscurity of the secretive FSB. Now, this contrast between a mag-fed LSW and a regular belt-fed LMG raises the question: why not both? Well, the Soviets asked that question too, and tried to answer it during the Plemyanik and Poplin projects, with both mag feeding and belt feeding, PU-1, PU-2, and PU-21 designs. These designs did not go far, however, as the PU-1 and PU-2 saw considerable reliability issues, and the PU-21 didn't see any real testing, as the Soviet GRAU had lost interest in that very drawn-out program. The later FN Mini-Me, adopted by the US Army as the M249 SAW, does indeed feature such dual feeding. However, the magazine feeding is, at best, notoriously fickle and unreliable. From 2011 to later in the decade, the Tokar 1 and 2 programs, under the patronage of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the now Russian Federation, called for more attempts at a dual-feeding machine gun. The Degtyarev plant, with its KORD 545 example, would be the most prominent component of this program. Kalashnikov Concern had fielded some machine gun designs, such as the FSB-ordered Western DRP, potential modifications of the PUs, and other attempts in the actual program, but any information on these, for right now, is esoteric and locked behind closed doors. Outside of the program, the Concern took a two-pronged approach to play the game publicly and for the long term. To cover at least the general need for a modern machine gun in 545, they began to develop both an exclusively belt-fed option, the RPL-20, and an exclusively mag-fed option, the RPK-400, later the RPK-16.
Ijevsk is the capital city of the Republic of Udmurtia, that is located 1,200 kilometers east from Moscow, in the Western Urals.
In the 2010s, the future of Russian small arms was expected of Kalashnikov Concern, formerly Izmash. However, for those on the inside, the industry giant's future looked bleak at many of those moments. The transformation of the Izmash factory into the Concern was but one case in a series of life buoys thrown to them to keep them afloat amongst internal scandal and bankruptcy scares. One such hope was Vladimir Zlobin, a chief designer at the Concern at the time, who was brought over from Tula. His story is its own rabbit hole, and we have covered a sliver of it already with our video on his AS-1 rifle, and we'll cover the full story of his AK-12 prototype and the final AK-12 in a future video. Nonetheless, in brief, his endeavors never bore fruit in the Ratnik Warrior program's trials. In 2015, politicking afoot, Kalashnikov Concern's 7.62 by 39mm submission, led by the KTC Design and Technology Center faction of the factory, would be tasked with salvaging the whole effort under a new chief designer, Sergei Uzhumtsev. He was actually the former CEO of the Molot factory and came over to the Concern in the previous year. The designers, including project lead Dmitry Dulganov, would turn to their previous designs for the AK-400 and grant it the furniture from the KM-AK upgrade kit that had previously been developed under the unrelated Obvez tender. These designs, with further developments, would pass Ratnik alongside the Degtyarev plant submissions. They would eventually become the Type 1 AK-12 and AK-15, which were fully adopted in 2018 by the Russian Army. During the early conflict in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, the Ukrainians would call it the quote-unquote anti-terrorist operation zone. Local Donbass militias, starting in 2014, would be organized by FSB-connected personnel such as Igor Strelik, Gherkin, regular Russian army elements, and SSO operatives. The latter specifically would put in an informal request to the Russian industry for a new light support weapon, or a new RPK. Naturally, this project would fall to the RPK manufacturer, the Molot factory. There, designer Dmitry Mikhailovich Chuachev would undertake the development of the prototype that would lead to the RPK-16. Molot would show off the new machine gun in a closed-door demonstration to the Russian military. However, after that meeting, the representatives of Kalashnikov Concern decided to take over the project. Thus, Molot had to relinquish it as the concern had seen significant political and financial investment by the Russian state at the time. Afterwards, the Molot factory origins of the weapon would fall into obscurity. Chuachev would go on to found his own firearms company, Rubicon Arms, and design projects such as the multi-caliber RA-15 AR and the civilian PKM-0. Thus, after all of that, in November 2015, at a Special Forces competition for the FSKN, the Federal Drug Control Service of Russia, the RPK-400 would be revealed to the world. In the hands of the concerned spokesperson at the time, Vladimir Onokoy, the machine gun mostly resembled the later RPK-16s, but with some distinct differences. Most noticeable was that it had a different handguard and a different scheme for the free-floating bipod. It bore a birdcage-like flash hider, while the gas block and front trunnion bore some geometry changes. The rear irons were also of a different flip-up diopter design, with protective fins. As the RPK was really Molot's child and not the Izmash factories, Sergei Uzhimtsev would turn to them for some of the manufacturing. Molot-made 1991 RPKS/RPK-74M receivers would be spotted as the basis for many of the early RPK-16 examples. The concern would even order about 50 barrels from them. At the Army 2016 exhibition, Kalashnikov Concern had by then bestowed the 400 series with their final product denominations. The Ratnik program AK-400 would become the 5.45 by 39mm AK-12 and the 7.62 by 39mm AK-15, while the RPK-400 would become the RPK-16, as in 2016, being roughly the year of its coming of age. By this point, the samples at the expo had their features and details mostly unified with their sister AK-12 and what would become the typical RPK-16. However, the short barrel example that many of the attendees had the chance to shoot still featured a barrel from the RPK-400 and its older gas block and flash hider design. The long-barreled example on display had an updated gas block, suppressor, and an all-polymer stock. This stock, with and without the additional clubbed grip, was featured on the SVK marksman rifle at the same time, and was the predecessor mold to what would become the stock on the Type II AK-12 model of 2020, and what's sold as the AK-EVO on the Russian civilian market. The gun would show up in many promotional images and publications from the concern and Russian media from then on, albeit the AK-EVO stock wouldn't make many more appearances on it. Around late 2017, early 2018, the Russian Ministry of Defense would put an order in for a small experimental batch of the RPK-16. This marked the beginning of its testing and evaluation. The Russian National Guard, the Rosgvardia, and other law enforcement elements would also take an interest around this time. In October of 2018, Lazarev Tactical photographed the machine gun at the range in the hands of a Spetsnaz officer. This sample featured some tuning by the operator, and bore an Elcan Spectre, the short barrel option, a knockoff Harris bipod, FDE foregrip, and a Fab Defense GL Core CP stock on an Armacon Monolith 3 AK buffer tube adapter. In 2020, the RPK-16 would show up outside of Russia in the throes and drama of the Syrian civil war. The now deposed president of the country, Bashar al-Assad, was an ophthalmology student turned Ba'athist party dictator. Syria and the Tartus military base had been a key ring on the fist of Russia's southern flank since the time of Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad. Now, the rise of the Islamist State and the most violent episode of the Arab Spring threatened it. While the revolution and ensuing civil war had begun in 2011, Russia would step in with a substantial air campaign, military police, Wagner mercenaries, and Spetsnaz teams in 2015. It was the latter that an RPK-16 would be spotted with. This sample, in the hands of the SSO, featured the long barrel option, a suppressor, the drum magazine, and an LPVO optic. One particular unit, the Spetsnaz of the 561st Emergency Rescue Center, would be spotted with the machine gun in both Russia and Syria in offhand appearances. The RPK-16 would get some particular limelight with the unit in a video, almost an advertisement, of a training demonstration of the unit's and Kalashnikov Concern's capabilities. This was recorded at one of their facilities in Sevastopol, in the disputed Crimea, around July of 2018. Military tests and evaluations around 2019 were wrapping up due to a lack of real adoption for the machine gun. That, however, didn't mean the RPK-16 would disappear from arsenals or that Kalashnikov Concern would entirely give up on it despite their course correction towards other developments. One photo in 2024 would emerge of the RPK-16 boasting a paint job and a thermal imaging scope. This was from a recovering VDV serviceman and a foreshadowing of what the machine gun had been getting up to recently, despite the lack of MOD interest. Another photo from the depths of the Concern would be an RPK-16 featuring Type 2 AK-12 furniture and an experimental ambidextrous selector, somewhat akin to the prototypes of the AK-EVO program. We would like to dub this incredibly obscure example the RPK-EVO. These features would never make it to the RPK-16 in the wild, however. A story about a killed-in-action Spetsnaz operator would eventually come out on a well-connected Russian Telegram channel. The operator in question, in two separate photos, had an RPK-16 in slightly different configurations and paint jobs. He was confirmed to have been KIA'd in the Donbass region during the first few months of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and to have served in Syria. In both photos, the gun featured regular capacity magazines and red dots, such as the Aimpoint Comp 5, paired with a magnifier or an Aimpoint T1. At least in the one without a bipod and short barrel, the gun was more likely in the role of an assault rifle, rather than a machine gun. Around the same time as the previous story, the Kalashnikov Expert VK page, AK Info, run by Pavel Tsitsin, would post a pretty technical interview with a longtime reader about the RPK-16 that they were currently using on the front lines in Ukraine. The interviewed Spetsnaz operator mentioned the use of the RPK-16 in his unit from early 2023 to spring 2024 in 3 on-front rotations. They mostly used it as an assault rifle, replacing one of their riflemen's AK-12s. While the kit was issued with both barrels, M125 drums, and 6L2301 30-round magazines, they ended up mostly fielding it with the 415mm barrel, suppressor, and the regular box magazines. The 590mm barrel had a prong on the flash hider break after 1500 rounds. The included suppressor, proprietary to the RPK-16, apparently served quite well, with adequate flash suppression and minimal gas blowback. The soldier compared it to a hexagon tactical offering that they had and said it performed better. On the opposite side of things, he was not particularly a fan of the barrel swapping process. Overall, the 415mm barrel saw at least 3,000 rounds, and they never experienced a cook-off with the closed-bolt gun. An oil can, a cleaning kit, a 6SH46M magazine pouch, and a Didal NV Narukavnik 4 magnified prism optic were also included from the armory. By this point, the only institution interested in feedback about the gun from the interviewed Spetsnaz was its creators, Kalashnikov Concern, who have special representatives embedded across the front to gather troop feedback about all of their deployed products. And those representatives of the Concern certainly would have heard the problems about the M125 95-round drums, which the Spetsnaz soldier had repeated to AK Info. In his experience, they were unreliable and caused misfeeds, failures to feed, and jams. Not only that, but they were fragile, and one drum managed to crack on the inside during use. This is far from an exception regarding these drums, other Russian attempts at higher capacity magazines, and just high capacity magazines and drums in general. These attempts include, but are not limited to, the 75-round M30, the 100-round M100 horizontal drums in both polymer and metal, the original quad stacks for the AKM, the 6L31, an experimental 7.62 by 39 quad stack around 2019, the Vyuga-11 drums, and even the SPU device that fed bullets from a belt box into the magwell of an AK. All these attempts to increase capacity beyond the 45-round long magazines of the RPK-74 just never met the military standard for reliability, simplicity, cost, and/or weight, despite the original requirements for such in the Ratnik program. The 7.62 by 39mm RPK metal drum did see adoption, but the long magazines were still held in higher regard, and, as stated, the miracle couldn't be repeated for 5.45 by 39mm. Aftermarket quad mags, such as puff guns or stitch profis, do see use in Ukraine, however purely as soldier-purchased endeavors, and have never had a lick of institutional testing. Our friend Deni Almaskhanov over at the Just Guns channel has a hands-on review of those that we recommend. The failures of magazine feeding for light machine guns amongst the beckoning call for fire superiority across the Ukrainian steppes and trenches are why belt-fed systems are now the hot new thing for the Russian military. Kalashnikov Concern's 5.45 by 39mm belt-fed RPL-20, after half a decade or more of development, is now finally being delivered to VDV troops, and even Tula is getting in on the action with their, also 5.45, OTS-142. That latter one is an oddity, based on the previous OTS-124 and 128 full-caliber belt feds and their MTS-566 sniper rifle. It features a nifty, quick-swap reloading system that still utilizes fabric belt boxes, and even keeps the linkages in the bag. The PKM and PKP, arguably MT Kalashnikov's real legacy, is still going strong with both aftermarket and adopted modernizations, such as, but not limited to, Zenitco's offerings, the PKZ, the 6P69, nice, the 6P41M, etc. RPK-74s, in general, are seeing a decline in deployment, while some desperation is committed for even older belt-fed systems such as RPDs, RP-46s, the Nikitin TKB-521, which is the freaking trial loser to the original PK, the Maxim, and North Korean Type 73s. This is something felt on both sides of the conflict. Thus, the RPK-16's biggest legacy is really in video games. Easily, the most iconic boss of the hit extraction shooter Escape From Tarkov is Achille. Inspired by the memes of Rainbow Six's Tachanka and the support class, he dons a Gopnik-themed look with Maska 1SCH helmet, custom 6B13M armor, a rip-off Adidas tracksuit, and his favorite support class weapon, the RPK-16. His home, the Interchange map featuring an abandoned shopping mall, modeled after a real mall outside of St. Petersburg, was added in patch 0.8 in April of 2018. Killa wouldn't claim it as his domain till his and the RPK-16's edition in patch 0.11 in December of 2018. In-game, it rests just outside of Tarkov City, in the semi-apocalyptic closed Norvinsk zone. The Russian devs behind EFT, Battlestate Games, and their COO, Nikita Buyanov, sport close relations with Kalashnikov Concern. They've done more than one PR range visit together, and BSG would later add another peculiar gun of theirs, the MP-153 Ultima. That's, of course, besides the obligatory inclusions of the standard AKs. In another popular game, the RPK-16 would be personified, as an unhinged MILF android. In the mobile gacha Girls Frontline. Okay. Due to happenstance, these are where the RPK-16 really forged its name instead of its obscure but existent military history, as it staves off becoming a truly forgotten weapon. It's a particular branch and tangent of the full AK-12 story that we eventually hope to cover, so stay tuned for that. All sources for the research of this video will be in a linked bibliography in the description. Special thanks to Just Guns' Deni Almaskhanov and TheWarzoneArmorer on Instagram for numerous conversations about Russian machine guns and small arms in general, plus their invaluable help on some of the finer details of this research. We would also like to thank Safar-Publishing for lending us some of the excellent photos from their upcoming book, Soviet Weapons of the Atomic Age. You can check out all of their pages down below in the description of this video. Also, make sure to check out our Twitter or community Discord as we post frequent spottings and uncovered info about small arms, OSINT, and history, which will probably include more info about the RPK-16. If you have stuck with us for this long, we'll key you up on a little secret. The AM-17 is next.